Hi class, this week's lecture is on Plato and Aristotle, but I want to provide a short talk about the Presocratic philosophers, who are philosophers that Plato and Aristotle are responding to, because they didn't emerge out of a bubble. Presocratic philosophers refer to 6th and 5th century before the Common Era Greek thinkers who introduced a brand new way of thinking to the world. Prior to the pre-Socratic philosophers, we have Hesiod, who is an authority, a Greek poet who is an authority on the gods, and Homer, whose writings are God-saturated, in that the gods control the weather, the gods are responsible for creating people, the gods can destroy people if they decide to. In other words, there's no order to the world. The order is just what the gods will it to be at any given moment, and they can always change their minds. So Thales, who's the first pre-Socratic philosopher, starts to look for a natural order to the universe. So he's primarily concerned with metaphysics, the fundamental makeup and nature of reality and the world, and looks to natural elements and predictable, consistent laws of nature in his thinking. So he introduces to the world humanism, which is the idea that the natural world can be understood by humans using the intellect, using reason. Okay? So I'm not going to get into details about Thales. I want to talk about two pre-Socratic philosophers who create, or help to bring about a philosophical problem that Plato essentially resolves. So the first philosopher is Heraclitus. And he saw that using the senses, okay, which makes the senses important, that the world was in constant change. It was in constant flux. So he is famous for saying that you can never put your foot into the same river twice. If you find yourself at a river, you put your foot in, you take your foot out. The next time you put your foot in, it is a fundamentally different river. It has different water. Some erosion, however minute, has occurred. So the whole makeup of the river has changed. And he saw this as a metaphor for everything in the material world. And he used as a symbol of his philosophy fire, okay? Because fire is constantly in motion, is changing, and can never be pinned down, into a single, unchanging substance. It's constant strife. It's constant war. Those are the kind of symbolic language, symbolic words that Heraclitus would use. So the world is in constant flux. And our senses tell us as much. Now, Heraclitus also saw underlying all that change and all that flux, a logos. And the logos can be thought of as an underlying order to the universe. And he didn't think that many could detect the logos, but he had detected it. So there's a bit of an elitism in Heraclitus' writings, and I'll give you a quote here. Of this world's being forever do men prove to be uncomprehending, both before they hear and once they have heard it. For although all things happen according to this word, they are like the unexperienced experiencing words and deeds such as I explain when I distinguish each thing according to its nature and show how it is. Other men are unaware of what they do when they are awake, just as they are forgetful of what they do when they are asleep. So there's a bit of elitism in Heraclitus, but he's essentially saying that using reason, one can detect the logos that underlies an otherwise chaotic, ever-changing world. And to detect logos, you have to use reason, and you have to have a very keen intellect, and you have to think very deeply and hard about the makeup and nature of the world. So Heraclitus' philosophy is known as an empiricist philosophy. Empiricism refers to the idea that knowledge is acquired via the senses, but not solely the senses. There is a place for reason as well. You have to use reason to interpret what is given to the senses. So his empiricist philosophy has a role for the senses and for reason. It's reason, after all, that helps us understand the logos, or the underlying rules and laws governing an ever-changing, ever-fluctuating world. So Heraclitus introduces to Western philosophy an empiricism, a respect for the senses that reason helps organize all that sense data. But we start to acquire knowledge by using our senses and looking at the world and how it acts. Okay, so that's Heraclitus, and we're going to now look at a critic of Heraclitus who ultimately calls into question empiricism and knowledge gained in part by the senses. And that thinker is Parmenides. Okay, so Parmenides is best known not for his conclusions or ultimate metaphysical ideas, but for his way of thinking. Parmenides was an anti-empiricism. Okay? He thought that the senses were not a reliable source of knowledge. Okay? Senses are not reliable. And what is reliable, according to Parmenides, is reason alone. We can use reason, logic, to understand the fundamental makeup of the universe. So this puts Parmenides in a camp known as rationalism, which is the idea that reason alone gives us knowledge. So as a rationalist, Parmenides wants to build an argument, just like we were talking about last week, with premises inferring a conclusion. So he wants to start with a first premise that is true, that can't be doubted. Okay, and the first premise he talks about is premise 1, and I'll post this in the module so you'll be able to really follow it. But what is not cannot exist. Okay? When you are talking about what is not, according to Parmenides, you are talking about nothing at all. Okay? So this reference to what is not is a reference to something that cannot possibly exist. Okay? And that seems, intuitively true. If you're talking about what is not, you are talking about nothing at all. There has to be some content to what we're talking about. And to talk about what is not is to talk about something that is empty of content. Okay? But this leads us, when we start using reason, it leads us to some interesting inferences. Because what this implies then is that things cannot change. Because when something changes, it is in a state of being one way, and then it changes, which means it is no longer what it was. In other words, it is now what formerly it was not. Okay? But we've determined in premise one that what is not cannot exist. So things cannot be something that they were once not. Okay? So it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but if you accept that what is not cannot exist, then things couldn't possibly change, because change involves going from what is not to what now is. Okay? And premise three, movement cannot exist. Because what is movement but being in one place and no longer being in that place? So where you are now is a place that you were not formerly. Okay? So movement, it requires us to talk about what is not. Okay, and so what this infers is that whatever exists now must be as it always was. Okay? Because there's no change and there's no movement. So what is now must be as it always was, which leads us to our conclusion. The universe is uniform throughout. Okay? If we accept that what is not cannot exist, and that leads us to reject the idea that things change, which is totally against Heraclitus' worldview, that things are constantly changing, and that movement cannot exist, then the universe is uniform, unchanging, a singular plenum that does not move, that only is and is never what it is not. Okay, so this seems like an absurd conclusion if you think that your senses give you knowledge, because the world doesn't appear to be uniform throughout at all. It seems to be ever changing and have things that are distinct from one another. But Parmenides argues essentially that the world is one singular uniform plenum that doesn't change and doesn't move. So this leads us to the idea that there's appearance, and that is different from reality. Okay? The appearance is what is given to the senses, and it gives us a certain way, ideas about what the world is like. But using reason, and reason alone, starting with a premise that we can agree on and then building off of it, we come to understand that reality is very different from how things appear. Okay? Logic and reason give us reality. The senses give us an appearance that is false. The appearance is an illusion to an underlying fundamental reality that, as we see, there is no change and there is no movement. So this sets up a problem that Plato is going to address between Parmenides and the use of pure reason to give us the idea that our senses, are flawed and only give us illusion. Logic and reason gives us reality, which doesn't reflect the appearance at all, versus Heraclitus, who's an empiricist and tells us that the senses do give us a view of how things actually are. Things are constantly in flux and changing. And we need some kind of resolution here, because both Parmenides and Heraclitus have given us reasonable, defended arguments with radically different conclusions.